Captain Simone Williams was a name well known and highly respected within the police force. As one of the few black women to rise to the rank of captain, her journey had been marked by hard work, grit, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Despite the obstacles she faced throughout her career, Simone maintained a calm yet commanding presence that her colleagues admired and her subordinates trusted. Her reputation was impeccable. She didn't flaunt her authority or demand respect with forceful words. Her actions spoke for themselves. For over 15 years, Simone had patrolled the city's toughest neighborhoods, rising through the ranks as she tackled crime with determination. Her leadership had transformed her precinct into one of the most respected in the city. Despite her accolades and promotions, Simone remained grounded. She didn't seek the spotlight or indulge in the privileges of her rank. Off duty, her demeanor was humble. She drove a modest sedan and dressed casually, making it a point to stay connected to the community she swore to serve. On this particular evening, Simone was exhausted. It had been a grueling week filled with meetings, administrative duties, and operational planning. Though she had planned to leave earlier, the workload kept her late at the station. It was now well past 9 p.m., and she was eager to get home, unwind, and enjoy a weekend away from the chaos of her responsibilities. She hadn't even changed out of her uniform, a sharp but simple navy ensemble adorned with her badge. Though in the dim light of the evening, it wasn't immediately noticeable. As she drove home, Simone realized her gas tank was nearly empty. Deciding to fill up at the nearest station, she turned into a small, run-down establishment on the city's outskirts. It wasn't in the safest part of town, but she had patrolled the area enough to feel comfortable. Besides, she was still in her police uniform, and her presence alone tended to deter trouble, or so she thought. Unbeknownst to Simone, Officer Mike Brennan was patrolling the same area that night. Brennan, a patrol cop in his mid-30s, had been with the force for nearly a decade, but his career had stalled. His once ambitious dreams of moving up the ranks had faded as his personal life unraveled. His marriage was on the rocks, and his frustration with his stalled career had morphed into bitterness. Over time, his deep-seated biases had intensified. To Brennan, certain neighborhoods meant trouble, and seeing someone like Simone, a black woman, at a gas station in this part of town immediately triggered his suspicions. From the safety of his patrol car, Brennan watched as Simone pulled into the station and began fueling her car. He couldn't see her badge or rank from his position. In his mind, she was just another person who didn't belong. Without calling it in or informing dispatch, Brennan decided to confront her. As Simone stood by her car, lost in thought and ready to head home, she noticed flashing lights in her rearview mirror. She sighed heavily, recognizing the familiar sight of a police cruiser pulling up behind her. Though she was a police captain, Simone had experienced unwarranted stops before. It was a reality she had long learned to navigate. But tonight she was too tired for theatrics. Her hand instinctively rested on the gas pump, her mind racing through the usual steps of staying calm and collected. Officer Brennan exited his vehicle, his posture radiating authority, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. His stance was clearly meant to intimidate. As he approached, Simone watched him carefully, noting the aggression in his stride. She had seen officers like Brennan before, those who wore their authority like a weapon, ready to pounce on anyone they deemed unworthy of respect. "Evening," Brennan barked, his eyes narrowing as he scanned her up and down. "Evening, officer," Simone replied calmly, her voice steady, though she knew where this encounter was heading. She had faced these confrontations before, and tonight she had little patience for it. "You got any reason to be in this area tonight?" Brennan demanded, his tone accusatory, as though her mere presence was enough to warrant suspicion. "You live around here?" Simone raised an eyebrow, keeping her demeanor calm and professional. "I'm just stopping for gas." "Officer, is there a problem?" Brennan's suspicion grew. To him, this woman didn't belong here, and he was determined to find something wrong. "You know this area has been under surveillance, right? Lot of criminal activity lately," he said, his words dripping with judgment. "Mind stepping away from the car for a second?" Simone could feel the tension building, but she wasn't one to back down easily. There was no reason for this interaction to escalate. She had done nothing wrong. Yet she knew how quickly things could spiral when dealing with an officer on a power trip. "I'm just fueling up my car, officer," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Is there a reason I'm being stopped? Brennan's patience was running thin. He was used to people complying without question, and Simone's refusal to immediately bend to his authority irked him. License and registration, he snapped, his voice growing harsher. Simone paused for a moment, considering her options. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she also knew she had every right to question the officer's motives. Without a word, she reached into her car and retrieved her documents, handing them over to Brennan. Brennan snatched them from her hand, barely glancing at the license before fixating on her. He was determined to make this encounter as difficult as possible. "Where are you coming from tonight?" he asked sharply, his tone more accusatory than curious. "I'm coming from work," Simone replied, still maintaining her composure. Brennan's eyes narrowed further. "And what kind of work would that be?" "I'm in law enforcement," Simone answered, deliberately withholding her rank. She wasn't trying to pull rank just yet, hoping the situation wouldn't escalate. Brennan sneered, clearly not believing her. "Law enforcement, huh? What department?" "City police," Simone replied evenly, though she could feel the frustration building inside her. Brennan wasn't buying it. To him, this was just another black woman trying to talk her way out of trouble. His hand hovered near his weapon as he ordered, "Step out of the vehicle." Simone hesitated for a moment. She had done nothing wrong, and this situation was quickly spiraling out of control. But she knew refusing could make things worse. She stepped out of the car, standing tall and composed as Brennan eyed her with suspicion. He gestured for her to move to the side, his eyes scanning her up and down, looking for any reason to justify his stop. As he began to circle her car, pretending to inspect it for any signs of illegal activity, Simone stood still, her mind racing with the possibilities of how this could end. Brennan crouched down, peering into the back seat as if searching for something. "You got anything in this car I should know about? Weapons? Drugs?" "No, officer," Simone said firmly. "Nothing at all. We'll see about that," Brennan muttered as he moved to the back of her car. Without hesitation, he opened the trunk. Simone clenched her jaw, her patience wearing thin. She had dealt with officers like this before, officers who couldn't see beyond their biases. But this time, the situation felt different. "What's this?" Brennan suddenly barked, holding up a small pouch that had been tucked away in the corner of the trunk. His eyes gleamed with the kind of satisfaction that comes from believing you've caught someone red-handed. He held it up in the air, waving it for effect. Simone's gaze shifted to the pouch in his hand, and she sighed internally. It was a first aid kit she always kept in her car for emergencies, a small, inconspicuous pouch that clearly contained bandages and medical supplies. But Brennan, determined to find something incriminating, seemed to think otherwise. "That's a first aid kit," Simone said, her voice steady but firm. "I keep it in my car in case of emergencies." Brennan didn't seem to hear her, or more likely, chose not to. "A first aid kit, huh?" he sneered. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Without waiting for a response, he unzipped the pouch and dumped its contents onto the ground. Bandages, antiseptic wipes, and gauze pads tumbled out onto the pavement. Brennan's expression faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered, masking his disappointment with more aggression. "Seems innocent enough," he muttered, kicking the items to the side. "But you can never be too careful, right?" Simone clenched her jaw, the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, subjected to an unnecessary search and blatant disrespect. She could feel her patience thinning, but she reminded herself to stay calm. Getting angry would only fuel Brennan's sense of superiority. "Officer, I've complied with your requests," Simone said, her tone measured. "If there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way." Brennan, still not ready to relinquish control, stepped closer to her, his hand once again resting on his belt. "Where are you rushing off to?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Got somewhere important to be?" "I'm heading home," Simone replied, keeping her answer short and to the point. "Home, huh?" Brennan's eyes scanned her up and down, his expression one of disbelief. "You got a pretty nice car for someone who claims to live around here." "What do you do again?" "I'm in law enforcement," Simone repeated, her patience wearing thin. She knew where this was going. Brennan was baiting her, trying to get her to react. "Law enforcement," Brennan echoed, clearly unimpressed. "And what exactly do you do in law enforcement? Dispatch? Filing paperwork?" Simone could feel the heat rising in her chest, The familiar sting of being underestimated. She had spent years proving herself in a male-dominated profession, working twice as hard to earn the respect of her colleagues. And yet here she was, being reduced to nothing more than a suspect in the eyes of an officer who couldn't see beyond his biases. "I'm a captain," she said finally, her voice steady but firm. For a moment, there was silence. Brennan blinked, clearly taken aback by the revelation. But he quickly recovered, his expression shifting to one of disbelief. "A captain?" he scoffed. "Yeah, right. You expect me to believe that?" Simone remained composed, though inside her frustration was mounting. She had always been careful not to pull rank unnecessarily. But in this moment, she realized there was no other option. She reached into her pocket and retrieved her identification, holding it up for Brennan to see. The shift in his expression was subtle but noticeable. Brennan stared at the badge, his mind racing to make sense of the situation. The badge was unmistakable. She was indeed a police captain. His grip on his belt loosened slightly. And for a moment, he seemed unsure of what to do next. But rather than back down or apologize, Brennan doubled down on his arrogance. "So what if you're a captain?" he muttered, his voice laced with defiance. "That doesn't mean you're above the law. Everyone's got to follow the rules." Simone's patience had finally reached its breaking point. She had endured enough disrespect for one night. Straightening her posture, she met Brennan's gaze head-on, her voice calm but commanding. "I follow the rules, officer," she said firmly. But this stop was never about the rules. Was it? "You saw a black woman in this neighborhood and assumed she didn't belong. You assumed I was up to no good because that's the narrative you've built in your mind." Brennan shifted uncomfortably, but Simone wasn't finished. "You searched my car without cause. You disrespected me without knowing who I am. And now that you do, you're still refusing to acknowledge your mistake. That's not law enforcement, that's prejudice." The weight of her words hung in the air, thick with unspoken truths. Brennan's bravado faltered, and for the first time that night, he looked uncertain. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Simone continued, her voice unwavering. "I've been in law enforcement long enough to know how this works. You made assumptions based on my skin color and my presence in this area. But what you didn't know is that I'm your superior. And I expect to be treated with the same respect and dignity as anyone else." Brennan's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but he couldn't bring himself to admit his wrongdoing. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and turned away, heading back to his patrol car. For a moment, Simone stood in silence, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She watched as Brennan drove off without another word, his taillights disappearing into the night. Though the encounter was over, the sting of it lingered. Simone had dealt with officers like Brennan before, officers who let their biases cloud their judgment, who saw people like her as threats rather than equals. It was a reality she had long accepted. But tonight, it felt more personal than ever. As she gathered her belongings from the ground and placed them back in her trunk, Simone took a deep breath. She had stood her ground and defended herself with grace and dignity. But the encounter had left a mark. She knew this wasn't the last time she would face discrimination, even within her own profession. But she was determined not to let it define her. Driving away from the gas station, Simone felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She had fought too hard to get where she was, and she wasn't about to let one misguided officer undermine her accomplishments. As the city lights blurred past her, she thought about the changes that still needed to happen within law enforcement. Bias and prejudice were deeply ingrained, and it would take more than just one conversation to dismantle them. But Simone was determined to be part of that change, to continue leading by example and challenging the status quo. She had made it this far, and she wasn't about to stop now.